say I grew up in East Tennessee. The truth is a little more colorful than that. My father was a preacher, and I went to 8 different elementary schools. I started school in Los Angeles, California, because it was during World War II, and my father worked for a Bible school there, and that kept him out of being drafted. And but I was the only white boy in school until the 5th grade, when we moved back to Iowa briefly. And we lived in Iowa for a few years and wound up in Dayton, Tennessee. I say some of that is just because I grew up to be different. I couldn't make friends because I would lose them if we lost. If we moved right away, it was a very, very bad thing to have friends. I felt different, alone. I was the only boy of 7 children. I was the oldest. On the one hand, I would put up a brave front. I was a very active person. I hustled a lot. I sold Christmas cards door to door when I was like 9 years old. I got my Social Security card when I was 9 years old. I learned how to fix appliances in high school. I also wrote stories for the Chattanooga News Free Press. But in all of that, there was a hole. It was amplified by significant circumstances between me and my father, which were not very friendly, and would be called abuse in most situations. And I left home immediately after graduating from high school. I hitchhiked to Knoxville, Tennessee, enrolled in college, and got a job, a night job at the Knoxville Journal, enhancing my journalistic skills. And at all those times there was available alcohol and other amenities around me in Ray County. I loved to play basketball, and I was pretty good at it. And I didn't even think about using any enhancement of alcohol. I was active in the church. So then I moved to Knoxville, had a good run there. Got married, which also made some complicated things with my family. And my wife and I moved to Jacksonville, Florida, and eventually to Orlando, Florida. So I was down there for 10 years, and I was gravitated in the PR business. I was a stringer for a lot of the moonshots from Cape Canaveral, working for Movietone News. That was a part-time job, but I worked for public relations and worked for a lot of people in housing developments and did a lot of construction work. And eventually got to my love, which is politics, and began taking on assignments in political campaigns. That continued. I moved to Washington here in 1969. But somewhere in that mess, I took a drink, and I was 20 years old. I had one child, another child on the way, and it for the first time gave me the relief I've been missing. I felt whole for the first time, and the fact that I couldn't stop drinking when I started didn't seem to matter to me a lot. I'm a person that once I took my first drink, I was a pretty committed alcoholic. I was dependent. If I ever started drinking, I was going to drink till I passed out. Began to realize right away that I didn't drink like other people, and I tried to organize my day so I I could finish my assignment and raise my family, and which mostly I did. But I was a person that if you found what was really benefiting you in life, why would you wait till 5 o'clock? It didn't make any sense to me. So I would drink during the day, and which made evenings kind of difficult. I might not get home, or I might not be able to do much when I got home. I didn't drink on weekends much because my small children were part of my my soul, and I wanted to be with them. And I would just stop on Friday night and not drink till Monday morning. And I got sober when I was 44. In those years, I moved to D.C., continued to work in campaigns for many years. I did over 115 to 120 campaigns. When I quit that business because it was difficult to drink as much as I was drinking and travel as much, I had a number of clients in the Congress of the United States and in state capitals around the country. Did mostly work in the South, some up the East Coast and in the Midwest. Did Iowa races, I was very well known in 1972 and 73 for putting the political action training program together for AFSCME, the Union of Public, Municipal, and County Public Employees Union. And their effort was to reach sanitation workers, and I taught thousands of them. In fact, they said 44,000 people by the year 2000 had gone through the training course that I designed to teach them how to work in politics. And some people think it was not a good thing to let public employees have that kind of power, but I thought they were citizens first, and they needed to have that kind of power, and I worked for the union to get that done. So I did that type of work. And it was rewarding. I was a pretty well-known professional at that time in the field, but life was pretty messed up due to my drinking. My geographic cure was to stay home, not travel anymore, and I got into the printing business because it was a business I kind of understood. But immediately I was not paying much attention to it, and the staff kind of had to run the place. It was 2 blocks from the White House here in Washington, D.C. But I had begun to go to AA meetings. My wife, my second wife, who's native of Washingtonian, had a friend whose doctor said you needed to go to Alcoholics Anonymous, and so we took her down there, and she got sober and remains sober to this day. And I was intrigued by what was going on there. It wasn't quite like church, which I remembered from childhood, but it wasn't quite like anything else I experienced, and I heard some wonderful stories. And I saw some people there that I had known in precinct work and mobilization work here in D.C. And so I continued, not that my wife knew it, but I would go back to different traditional recovery meetings. That continued for 8 or 9 months, and then I had a kind of a serious crash landing in a gathering that was very important to me and my clients, and I was completely in a blackout, and that was my last drunk. It lasted. I was blacked out until about a day and a half later. I don't know. I don't remember what I did. I was told that the hotel called security 3 times to have me thrown out of the place. And I would keep finding a way to come back in such a behavior like that. But it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I finally said, I really say that morning after it's the only time that God spoke to me directly. I heard a voice, and that voice said, get up, go back to those people and do what they do. And that's what I did. And I haven't had a drink since March 23rd, 1982. But no, my familiarity with the field began pretty quickly, however, because being an activist, I didn't really understand that you weren't supposed to talk about it. My business was downtown D.C. Everybody knew that I drank. There was no way for me to really be anonymous. My first sponsor had to teach me how to see anonymity as a spiritual value, which I did, and I appreciate. I know the importance of all recovery groups for newcomers being a sacred obligation to be safe. That's the first thing, is to be safe. I got to know people in the business. I began service work, working in the city's treatment center, which was called Carrick Hall. And I took meetings there for many years, and I got to know many of the people there. I had a good occasion. I was not interested in becoming a counselor, but I had a friend who I thought would make a good counselor, but he wouldn't go. So I said, I'll go to school with you. And so I took the first half of a CAC course, and I got some good information. I think I would have gotten some formal treatment. For about 10 years, I served on the Mayor's Advisory Committee of Alcoholism here. I did service work program, but I left politics alone. In 1992 campaign, I had sold my printing business in 91, and I did work for the Clinton Gore ticket. And one of the results of that was that SAMHSA was reorganized in the federal government. It was organized. It used to be ADAMHA, and they had an advisory council for substance use disorders, and they appointed me to that. and I'll be forever grateful for that opportunity. I got a phone call at DHS saying, Mr. Allum, the White House has appointed you to the CSAT Advisory Committee. We have understood that you're a person in recovery from alcoholism. Is that true? I said, yes. And I said, oh, good, you can be our recovery member. And I said, how big is this committee? And they said, oh, I think there's 16 people on it. I said, 16 people, and I'm the only one in recovery. And we'll say, as far as we know. So I was followed by a couple people later on. I served on that position for 6 years. And it exposed me to the NIH work, NIDA work, to SAMHSA work. I met hundreds of wonderful people all over the country involved in the treatment industry and in the recovery industry. And I began to have my own opinions about my experience as a grassroots citizen activist and how that applies to people in recovery and why we weren't represented. About that same time, United States Senator Harold Hughes, who engineered the passage of the Hughes Act in 1968-69, was becoming very concerned. He's a political animal himself, and in the early 90s he was seeing that the benefits of that legislation were being ignored, and that we were on the road to the war on drugs and a lot of phenomenal and very harmful policies, practices, and laws. And it was diminishing even more the willingness of people to speak up and to act against that thing. But he started an organization called Society of America Honors Recovery. It was actually formed in '91. In 1993, he came to me and said, "Can you help me?" And I became executive director of the Society of America Honors Recovery. And that gave me a lot of exposure to even more of the industry. But it was an uphill grind. We couldn't raise money. People would get on our mailing list. We'd mail them something. They'd call screaming at you because you broke their anonymity, threatened to sue. I mean, it was just a really hard time to mobilize people. But I do believe in the 2 years that I worked with Harold in that period of time that we sowed a lot of seeds that helped the field to become aware of citizen opportunity, citizen rights down the road. I was at a conference in Baltimore yesterday, the Turk Conference, a very famous conference here. It was in the Baltimore Convention Center. I was recalling with Jim O'Hara and many other old-timers there that it was 24 years ago in April this month that we held the first SOAR convention in there, and we had an astounding crowd of 75 people in this massive convention center. We went on from there. They had one in St. Louis, which was much better. We had 500 people there. And then to Santa Monica, California, we had about 80 people there. And that we kind of ran out of steam after doing those 3 conferences. But a lot of people had faith and worked to make the advocacy movement have some kind of a beginning in those years from 92 to 95. Then we kind of went officially underground for a while. But I look back to those days, and I still have seen people in meetings across the country, and they'll see me there, and they'll roll out their old SOAR T-shirt and say, with the eagle on it, and talk about the days when we were really struggling, trying to get people to come out of the closet and say, I'm a citizen and I'm in recovery, and you could be too, and we need to treat people differently. I was blessed, though, to be asked to join the D.C. government in a couple capacities. I was in the mayor's office for a little while, and then moved to the mental health system, and I became the director of operations for the D.C. mental health system for about 6 years. And that was wonderful for me to see my disease of addiction from a different angle, from a mental health angle. I was the first one to bring co-occurring training to the district area here, and we trained some 200 people. Kathleen Miaka from New York came down and did the teaching. That later Ken Minkoff came and did more training and helped us develop the first co-occurring clinic in the public sector here. And so I'm very proud of achievement. I also was the one to put mental health administrators in elementary schools on occasional so they could be a resource for the counselors in elementary schools. That was a new initiative in 1998, which it now covers 87 schools in District of Columbia. So those are a couple of things that I accomplished directly. But on the side, I was still an activist in the recovery community. I was greatly concerned that that we had become a public sector issue. We were so unlike oncology, so unlike hypertension, so unlike diabetes. If you wanted treatment for our disease, you had to lose everything before you got it. You had to become a public client. Insurance companies were not paying for treatment. Back in the 80s, they paid very well, but they cut all that off to bend the curve on health. They picked on people that were weak, and we were very weak. In the aftermath of them defeating the Hillary Clinton health care bill, they still felt an obligation to cut the cost curve, and they did it by shutting down the weak people. And we were very weak politically. Our constituency did not have any power at all. And they knew they'd be paying a margin for that. They knew down the road other kinds of health concerns. They knew all that. The science was not that weak, but they did it for temporary political gain. In 2002, they began to have a little more attention in the insurance industry to covering again. It finally grew, and still growing today to have a more responsible position. But the concern I had was that professionally, and it lasts to this day. You go to forums of scientists that consider our disease. They talk in terms of everything being financed by Medicaid or public funds or in public clinics or in jails. All that's necessary, don't get me wrong, but that's not the safety net. We have crashed the safety net. The safety net, it becomes a primary care system for people that are in final stage alcoholism and drug addiction. Final stage. We completely ignore the earlier stages. And as a business person, I was seeing this happen and being very concerned about the fact that we were so drastically separated from a normal path of disease in a general health system. So I began to turn my attention to more issues concerning that. And what I'm doing today is very much part of that recognition and trying to what I call mainstream addiction disease, mainstream it as a health concern that has earlier stages that nobody recognizes. I really like the work of Mark Willenbring when he was in NIAAA, and he resigned and went back to St. Paul about the same time that I started this clinic, and doing some of the similar kind of work, trying to be connected to the primary health care system in different new ways. And his data is very simple. 70% of Americans, and this is data in 2002, 2003, but still relevant today, 70% of the people either don't drink at all, drink safely, use drugs safely, just don't have a problem. It's not an issue for them. They can pick it up, lay it down. It's just not a concern. 3 to 4% of the population are in end-stage addiction disease, and they're very near death. And our industry concentrates almost 100% on these people who are in end-stage illness and have very difficult times, even in the best of circumstances, regaining a normal life. Many of us do, but I'm in that 4%, you know. And there's wonderful recovery stories about people who get help and care. But the macro story that's being missed, 26% of Americans use in varying degrees, but are at risk for being independent. They're on a track, the same way you'd be on a track for diabetes, same way you'd be on a track for cancer. And the things you do with cancer is you strive to see first symptoms and do something about it on the one hand, and on the other hand, when you get to where you think you have contained the illness, you have 5 years of measurement and follow-up. Now that's a disease model. And we are nowhere close to that. We are nowhere close to that. If we follow clients a year, we think we're really, over the pale. It's just unbelievable. But the critical part is that millions of people, millions and millions, 26% of the people have jobs, have homes, have families, have health insurance, pay their health insurance either as part of their job, and when they get sick, it's not available to them. Why? Because they're ignored until they lose the house, the family, the insurance, and they become public client. And instead of getting intervened by a primary care doctor, they get intervened by a policeman. And that's a crime. That's a crime against our society. We're driven by finances, but mainly because we don't fight back. And so what do we inherit? We inherit a kind of a sick system, and the core begins with how you value people. And our professional staff is the lowest paid in the health industry, and not just by a couple dollars. I mean, they are pitifully, very badly ranked. Most people who get into the addiction service field have the professional competence, but also have a cause for doing it, an uncle and a child. And the NADAC has better numbers than I do, but we're losing them now because those people are aging out, and we're not attracting young talent that much. And when people have their kids go to college in this town, these counselors get jobs as prison guards, because it's roughly the same credentials that are required, and they immediately get a 50% pay raise, and now they can send their kids to school. I mean, what a career ladder. I mean, it's just sad to see this good talent have to scramble around like that to survive, and the industry itself is doing best it can, but has an honest reputation for recycling. I mean, that's true, that people recycle. I know one of the saddest things I heard, I was on a team that was trying to introduce Vivitrol to the nation, and I went to Missouri where I had some contacts and some people, and I made a presentation there among a whole group of counselors. And this woman came up and she said her name and what treatment center she worked for, and she says, "You're telling us that if we do help with these medication-assisted treatment and put people on a better path, that there'll be few relapses." And I said, "Exactly right." I said, "My boss couldn't stand for that. We program in the relapses to make ends meet." I said, "What a sad thing for a counselor to have to deliver that message." We count on the relapses to make our budget. Now, can you imagine a foot and ankle clinic, a diabetes clinic, making a statement like that? It just shows how, even today, how far separated we are. In a time of real diversity and conflict in Congress and elsewhere in policy, they've been able to join on issue of opioid use and other substance use disorders, primarily to save money on the jail side. They finally have realized that we are treating people unfairly. That we, in many cases, could be tried in the UN courts for how we abuse our own citizens. We do jail more people than anywhere in the world. And so that has unified us. And what typically happens is people just really do go for the short-term goals. They don't see it as a long-term thing. And certainly I praise the actions of the President. I praise the actions of Congress that have tried to end 3 strikes and you're out, have tried to make some sense out of criminal justice reform, have tried, passed the Parity Act, tried to let the insurance industry be a solid partnership in modern medicine. And some of those things are happening. Sometimes they're happening for different reasons than they were intended. The downside is that we add to the problem because we have our little nest eggs that we're philosophical or otherwise, in which I have to pound the table to to defend who I am, and that is sad. But meanwhile, the younger people and the population at large is significantly changing their attitudes, just like they did about smoking. And the upside is that nobody knows where that's really going to go, but it is having an impact on insurance company behavior. Here in the District of Columbia, we have 35 licenses to treat addiction disease. 35, okay? Like 2 take commercial insurance. 33 depend on the public dollar, either Medicaid, Medicare, or some other block grant funding. This is so out of proportion to any health issue, but it's changing. There is a market demand being met by our clinic and another clinic, Colmac, and we could use some more, because this is where the market should be. So change is coming, but it'll be rough. And it is disappointing to go to conferences of professional people and have people bring up these issues of, I believe, yesterday. They feel threatened for their model. Instead of embracing the change, instead of helping steer the change, to extend the recovery experience, to get a pathway concept established, much like cancer has or diabetes has. Instead of seeing the medical industry and medical services as part of this process, to say, no, I'd rather do it my way. And my way was dealing in a very neglected, narrow field, and depending on spiritual values, which are important to any possibility, but to exclusively depend on that, on populations that were very, very sick. And that's just not holistic at all. We believe that everything should be on the table for every person. Client-directed care system says, what part of this table works for you? Now, we can change this next week, but let's look at what works for you. And that's completely different from either side of this argument, where people say, oh, we know that this particular medicine has this kind of an effect. Everybody's got to take it. And that happens. It happens in a lot of things. To give you an idea how that works for us, in a census of 95 to 100 people, 17, 18 people are on some sort of craving stop, like Vivitrol or Suboxone. 17 people, not 100%. 17 to 18. It might get to 21 sometime. That's the kind of thing we feel is appropriate. These are new tools. They have great benefits, but to just universally put them in there, that's not a policy that's workable. I just don't think that criminalization has, and there's a long history. It predates even the United States being formed. I mean, going back centuries, that criminalizing behaviors of any kind has never had a positive outcome. I'm saying never has had a positive outcome. So to turn to those kind of policies, to me, is kind of sad. Does that mean that because we legalize alcohol, that we endorse using it to excess? In many ways that has happened, you know. And the same thing will happen by legalizing XYZ drug. But I don't think, in my experience, that fighting to maintain criminalization of marijuana is in anybody's interest. Part of my service is I take recovery meetings to the jail. I've been doing it for years. And there's several lessons out of that. I'm in the District of Columbia, where we arrest people for marijuana abuses, equally white, Hispanic, and black. In the last 8 years, I've been in the same basic facility. I saw the second white man down there about a month ago. The second white man in 8 years in this program. So, first of all, I don't think criminalization works. Secondly, you're really promoting racism. Because if you're telling me that you apply it equally, the evidence is not there. Evidence is it's not applied equally. So you're setting up ways for people to start exercising their prejudices. They're setting up ways to do things that are, I think, illegal. Isn't it much better to have education policies, so that when somebody graduates from high school and they know what a common cold is, they know what the symptoms of cancer are, they know what the symptoms of many illnesses are, they know the mumps, they know the measles, and they're never told the symptoms of people who can drink safely versus those who can't, who might be at risk. They're not told. Well, why can't we do that? Why do we have to pass laws to put people in jail when they got something in their hip pocket? And the second thing we do, we need a unified health system that treats all parts of health. I mean, we struggle every day to get nurses in med-surg wards to understand expert and ask 3 simple questions about a patient who had to stop the operation in the operating room because there was cocaine in the bloodstream. But they can't ask 3 goddamn questions, excuse me the language. You know, why can't we do all these things that are relevant and science is proven to reach population education, to reach population control of a disease and addiction, instead of singling out people for criminal action? I just don't think that's in anybody's interest. Now, I have lots of friends who are on the front lines fighting the legalization of marijuana, and I guess my secondary problem is that the more we talk about that, the less we talk about the important issues, in my view. So this is the most I've ever said about it in somebody recording it, because I don't like to talk about it at all. It just seems to get the issue away from what I believe we should be talking about. That Harold deserves a lot of credit for it being quite elderly, but still having the passion to tell people it's time to stand up. It's time to, as Carol McDade would say, to have a constituency of consequence. That it's just like any other cause, whether you're for peace or you're for war. There's constituencies that really form policies in this country. I know people have trouble believing that sometimes. They think it's all done behind their back, and that big money counts. All that's true, but constituencies of consequence are the fundamental bedrock of public thought, public action, and eventually political action. And we have been hindered because of centuries of discrimination. You can call it stigma if you want to, but I call it discrimination. Centuries of discrimination have demoralized the population that is most concerned. And it hasn't just done it to the individuals who suffer from addiction disease, but their parents and their families. They have not recognized that they're part of the illness. They have damage from that illness, and they also have the right as a citizen to get around that. In fact, some of the best stuff happening today is being done by parents because they don't carry so much of the discrimination. So anyway, I believe Harold deserves a lot of credit for the things he said. He's still being quoted in literature for the 4 or 5 years of civil activism. He passed away in the late 90s, and he was just mortified by the war on drugs and what was going on. It was very sad, his view on it, and yet he contributed so much to our field, and part of it was laying the grassworks for a citizen movement. And so when I left the D.C. government in 2002, there was a transformation at the Johnson Institute, which built on the work of Vernon Johnson and his wonderful work at devising intervention tactics, which I think, from a business perspective, served as a sales force for the residential treatment community. And in its time and its place, it did wonderful work. And at one time, they trained 8,000 people a year. The Johnson method of interventions, and the publishing of their books resulted in a pretty good foundation that was pretty well funded. When insurance kind of shut that business down or made it much more difficult, that was not the main goal of the Johnson Institute. Main goal had to move a little beyond that to the underpinnings of our situation, and that began to happen through what they did in having what was called the forum. They held forums here twice a year, and invited to come together of the community. Every association, NADAC government and private, would meet at the Washington Hotel and discuss mutual and common needs. That was expanded when William Cope Moyers became president of Johnson Institute, and they had a committee on education. This is headed by Paul Samuels of the Election Center. And that committee actually proposed for the first time an independent organization that would really focus on people in recovery and their families. And it was called the Alliance Project. The Alliance Project took off, and they really picked up on a lot of the philosophies and teachings that Harold and I had promulgated in the early 90s. And we had a real summit October 5th, 2001, just a few days after 9/11 in St. Paul, and it was really history setting. For the first time, people spent 2 or 3 days to figure out what was a common message, how could they pull things together. And it really put the field on a new footing and new space. Before that, any public messages were always delivered by people from treatment centers, people 1 or 2 steps removed from the real people who were in recovery. And that began to change right there. The Alliance Project eventually became the Faces and Voices of Recovery. William Cope Moyers resigned, took a job back at Hazleton, and I was asked to become president of Johnson Institute at that time. And kind of semi-sponsorship by Johnson Institute of the Faces and Voices, both financially and through ideas, really was the early days of that formation. We continued to use the gathering in Washington called the Forum, and I expanded it in the press club we would have speakers like Tom McClellan, and we always had a science presentation at every meeting. Then we had a political one, somebody from the Hill, and we had all the prevention people. We had Sis Winger was a great leader in that organization from National Council for Children, and it just really was a good discussion space, and we were able to. And then it was governed for a while by a trio, myself and Stacia Murphy from NCADD, and Paul Samuels. We were in the very early growth, and I remember when we hired Pat Taylor, and she had brought a lot of good experience to the field. And it's really grown enormously since then. But it was like striking a match to the straw field, because the people were moving ahead of us. There was a new, this is my personal belief, I believe that since 2004, 2005, that the recovery community has taken a decided different turn because the culture is different. Electronics is different. People look at their cell phones more. The young people that come into treatment today just don't understand what we talked about 15, 20 years ago about never telling anybody that you're in recovery. It doesn't make sense to them. And so there's a new awareness on the part of people that part of life is, and not just to become connected, but to have your view accepted, to be heard for whatever your cause is. So people want to be heard, and so that cultural evolution is happening at the same time that we had a facility for doing it. Eventually, today, Faces and Voices represents I think 200 local organizations, like here in the district, the DC Recovery Community Alliance, and some fabulous work's been done by the people in Connecticut, the people in Dallas, Texas, to contribute to training. They have mobilized and trained the whole peer services industry, and it's an industry. I call it that because in a business sense, that's what they are, and they have brought a new element to the field that's long overdue. And that technology has been borrowed. The mental health people right away said, "Oh, we know all about peer review," and they acted like it's their own. But they really, like motivational interviewing, like peer review, a lot of the stuff that was started in our field. But we didn't have the power or the standing, if you will, in other industries. But peer review is a big thing, and peer services are a big thing in diabetes care today. But it began in our industry, and it began by the foot soldier work of people in Faces and Voices of Recovery. And then we had a huge breakthrough with my friend Greg Williams and his Anonymous People movie. I mean, that just captured, again, it didn't start so much anything as to celebrate something. He saw things happening, and he wanted to document it. And some people say he started something. What he will tell you, he says, I showed what was going on, and encouraged other people to get involved too. But he didn't invent it. He documented it, and people saw people like themselves walking by that screen. You know, there's Johnny Allum. He can do that, so can I. You know, and it's just really set fire to the field. And we have the fledgling things today of what Carol calls the constituency of consequence. That can go to a hearing, can go on to an educational event, can go on television or a blog and talk about the issues and be listened to as a constituency of people who share a common concern. I'm certainly, like many people have said, that I worry sometimes about the interchange of different, our voices saying different things and saying things that I think might not be so wise to have a common message, but that's just how life works. You know, I've lived long enough to see the anti-war movement, to see and people call many of these movements failure. But if you look at the Congress, 5 years later, there's significantly different membership because this other stuff happened. And that's going on today. It's just wonderful to observe. I keep thinking if I could send a telegram to Harold and say, Harold, you won't believe what happened today. What I've tried to describe is how the culture has grown in its recognition of the disease. I was 44 when I came in. I was considered very, very young. Well, very, very young today is 14, you know. Part of it is due to the kind of drugs that are available. You'll die before you're 44 if you don't get help. But generally speaking, it's just the understanding curve is going up. Are we where we should be? No, but the curve is going up. But it'd be not fair to characterize the 90s, for instance, only in terms of the awful war on drugs and the policies that were permitted. Because in fact, the science of the 90s gave us so much hope. We learned more about the brain in the 90s than we knew entirely civilization up to that point. And it was practical knowledge. And it was able to be researched and defined. And it has developed some of the things that are controversial now, like medication-assisted recovery. But more importantly, all the footwork of what I've been describing is a common health system. That comes from science-based work that was done in the 90s. Now, a lot of it worked as though there was only a public system and not a private system and commercial insurance? Yeah, it tends even to this day to thinking that things only happen when the federal dollar spends for it, and instead of utilizing the resources like all healthcare do. But that kind of little biases are things we can pick about. It'll eventually find its way into, and has finding its way in the whole field. I'm an advocate that outpatient should be the front door of addiction disease. That's what happens to cancer. You don't go immediately to Johns Hopkins for a major operation. You go to a doctor in a clinic. And you go to your primary care doctor. Your primary says, you ought to see Dr. Jones, and she's 2 doors down the street, and she's in this oncology clinic. And it's a team effort that's advised by science and developed in practices that are commercially available and can fit the norm of the health system. That's happening largely to us as a result, not just the constituency and consequence growing and advocacy and us telling our stories, but the ability of science to confirm that there are things we can do for this 26%. If you're at risk today, you do not have to become dependent. There are things you can do now. and the whole documentation behind the screening and brief and referral treatment, that science is for real, and it's new. And we're in the middle of applying it. We're not at the end of applying, we're in the middle. So I wanted to mention the important work that was done a lot under some of the government guidance of NIDA and NIAAA and the general health research, but also by significant institutions at Harvard and Rutgers and places that have invested in that wonderful work that was done in the 90s, and some of the stars that have science stars that have come out of that.